Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to another show. I'm doing a morning one. Oh, well, morning for me. If anyone's catching this live, regardless of where you're catching it, I think most people watch maybe from the U.S. So there's only about three timelines to really contend with, or three time zones rather. But for any of you internationally or anything like that, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, whatever. I botched that. So yeah, like I said, I did a review last night of a review. Time Rabbits dropped a few of them, and they've been pretty interesting conversations. They've been covering some pretty familiar territory, and this one's really no different. This one is Darth Dawkins and Thurli discuss the problem of evil, and I think the most interesting thing about this, at least for me, different people will take different things away from it. There's kind of an extended section in this video. This isn't a spoiler by any means, not, where Darth kind of lays out what I think is generally his eschatology. For those of you who don't know the term or don't care, or don't remember, and don't never heard of it, eschatology is a theological word talking about kind of God's return, God's judgment, end of days. It's that kind of thing in a religion. And specifically in Christianity. There's different takes on this, and it's not always clear. There's a lot of inside baseball that happens with Christians when it comes to eschatology about what they believe in. Do they believe that your body is physically resurrected from the ground or rematerialized in a particular way? Are you Is it just your soul that leaves your body? Is the death of your physical body necessary in order for your soul to then transfer to the next plane and thrive? These kinds of things. These are all kind of different, different takes on some of this stuff. And I don't know entirely now what's the what's the sort of main what's the consensus view on this, because a lot of Christians debate this. In fact, they have debates about this, whether they're when it comes to Revelation, which the book of Revelations, um, or well, Revelation, sorry, it's the Revelation of St. John, the last book of the New Testament. That book for Christians, depending on their spin on it, the way they approach it can really kind of affect them. Most of the people that you end up seeing on, and I'm sorry to get into this kind of pedantic technical stuff first thing in the video, but a lot of what they end up getting into, I think most Christians that people tend to encounter online or street preachers or anything like that, are usually hammering a futurist view from the book of Revelation. They treat the book of Revelation, the Revelation of St. John, as a prophecy about to happen and the signs and things. And these are the people that will stand in front of a school board and tell you that anti-vaxxers and that the vaccine and the pandemic, these are all signs of the end coming, and anyone who's getting the vaccine, that's a mark of the beast, is according to the book of Revelation, and yada yada yada. That's a futurist right there, right? They're trying to superimpose things from that book onto current events to say that the prophecy is coming true. But there are also people who are preterists, who believe that Revelation is aspects of Revelation or the whole thing has already sort of come to pass, right? And then there's a couple of other ones. There's futurist, preterist. I can't remember there's two other categories in there. I'm kind of blanking on what they are. I think the other ones. Well, the other ones are. I believe it was a historicist one. They take the writing of Revelation as sort of a I don't think there's a genre for it. I don't call it a diatribe. It's I don't know. Basically, it's a screed essentially against Rome, right? It had kind of a political message, and so they don't take it as having some kind of prophetic thing. They just sort of look at it as a message coming from this individual from the time of the early Christian church, writing strongly about sort of the powers that be in the world and using a lot of symbolic language to describe what was wrong with them and what was going to happen to them and how the church and Christianity was going to. That's my particular view of that. I think that actually holds to it. And I think the book of Revelation actually informs and fortifies Christian nationalism and Christian chauvinism, and more frightening, Christian fascism. So that's my take on it. So sorry, I'm a little caffeinated this morning, so I'm probably wandering around too much. Anyway, the reason to bring that all up, all that junk, is that there is, depending on how you approach this kind of stuff, when Darth starts talking about this stuff, he tends to machine gun out a lot of terms and a lot of phrases that I think he's quite glib at doing, and that's not entirely his fault. I mean, I blame him for almost everything when I hear him talk, but in this case, most Christians will do this because they have a head full of this stuff, either from Sunday school, from church, years of upbringing, stuff they've read, and it's hard to parse out exactly, you know, where the facts where the facts even begin and where a lot of this is just theology or speculation or whatever. But Darth does a pretty good job of laying out for Thurli in this conversation a fairly concise view of what he thinks, a sort of a comprehensive view of how this works and why it's, most importantly, why it's set up the way it is in this discussion of the problem of evil. So without any more delay, now that I've lost a few viewers, I wouldn't blame you. Also, I want to mention, welcome to everybody who's shown up live. I can't mention you all by name. It looks like there's several of you here, but thank you all for showing up. I will be highlighting your comments as we go. As usual, if you have problems with the audio, let me know. Apologies to Brainbug and Carlton Winston. I think they're still currently streaming right now. I was actually watching Carlton Winston's stream. He's reviewing an interesting guy named D-Roy Cruz, and I think he's still live right now. And Brainbug, who's someone that I also know on here, does some interesting videos on entomology and cryptozoology. He had a video going on, so I might be overlapping with them. But I wanted to do this video now before I have things happening in the rest of the afternoon, and I'll be away from the computer and away from social media for the most part. So anyway, apologies to them, but I will be catching their videos, I hope. And yeah. Here we go. So yeah, as usual, let me know. We're going to start this video now. I believe I've got it queued up here. Let me wind it back to the beginning here. And here we go.
Record these. Hey, Tom Rabbit.
Why is there so much suffering, Dawkins?
Because man rebelled against God after his initial creation, and the suffering that goes on through the course of human history is a temporal judgment that God has upon human beings for rebelling against him. And it also serves as a secondary purpose, as a constant reminder and motivation to seek eternal life and not to love this present world.
So you believe suffering is omnibenevolence?
God's omnibenevolence was
Yeah, you do. If you get 3 marks of the beast, do you get a price? I think yeah, if you mean like a discount, yeah, you do. But that's how they get you. You know, that's how they get you. Amazon Prime could be the mark of the beast. You know, you pay that thing, you get that card. I mean, when Jeff Bezos comes out and was like, hey, you know what? Perpetual Prime membership for those that get the barcode, you know, laser burned into the back of their neck. Believe it, you will hear Christians saying that's the mark of the beast. Jesus is right around the corner any second now.
Displayed in creation. There was no suffering. The suffering is a display of God's righteous judgment. Now, it is benevolent that God allows the.
Now that's an interesting take. I don't mean to posit that soon into it, but automatically, like he's already getting into this thing where, well, God's omnibenevolence was displayed as soon as he created everything. That's kind of a tough one, right? There are plenty of people who make this argument that, well, if God is omniscient and that he knows the outcome of all this kind of stuff, and he knows that there's going to be suffering, and suffering isn't something that he would want to have, right? He doesn't want sin. He doesn't want suffering. He could prevent that by not creating the world at all, or not creating the world the way he did, or not creating humans, right? All of those end up taking down different. You end up into different kind of arguments with Christians, depending on which avenue you take there. I don't think those are the only 3 by any means. But that's an interesting claim. Well, God has. This is a very not incredulous, servile outlook on this. Well, the fact that God made us in any way is a sign of how great he is and how good he is. I mean, what if he hadn't made you? Well, you know, then you have to actually think about your existence in kind of an existential kind of way. You know, it's possible that I could have the case of my existence, the fact of my existence, could have been otherwise. I could have not existed. based on the way Darth tends to frame God's properties and how he works, I kind of seem inevitable. Not like Thanos inevitable, but your existence and my existence. If we exist, it was because it was God's plan, and it was God's plan all along. We're not incidental. We're part of a plan. Um, so, for Darth to be like, well, hey, I think embedded into what he's starting to say here is like, well, God's omnibenevolence is on display when he creates you. Yeah, but you're already part of it. Like, if he's willing to keep it consistent, be like, okay, well, you're part of a plan. That's less interesting, right? Like, I think Darth would take the psychological route and be like, well, what if God didn't make it? You wouldn't have a life to experience at all, so you owe that to God, right? But that's not really the kind of God that Darth believes in. I'm part of his plan, which means I'm more like a tool, right? Or an actor. Like, I'm a necessary component of this entire mechanism that he's built. And I wouldn't be here unless he had this all worked out. And he has it all worked out. He has to have it all worked out. So if you take that to a certain extent, I think I would be less thankful about that existence as opposed to the existence that I think Darth's trying to offer here. We're like, well, he's so great because he allowed you, he gave you life, as opposed to what? Not giving you life, right? Was that really in the cards? No, God doesn't operate probabilistically. It's a plan. So Darth, I think, is already on shaky ground here, but this kind of idea of, well, he's great because he made everything. Not necessarily. If he creates a world that he knows is going to lead to all this suffering and the problem of evil, just from the jump, there's lots of different versions of it. And kind of the two, there's the evidential problem of evil and then the logical problem of evil. I think the evidential problem of evil is the one that most people end up either being convinced by or the one that really bugs them. And I think it's the one that, I think if it starts to gnaw at Christians, it's the one most likely to kind of, if anything's going to kind of dissuade them from the faith, I think the evidential problem for evil is the one that really gets them. It's not the fact that there is suffering, like when you stub your toe, or you break a nail, or you get a mild infection, or you caught the flu. That's not the suffering. And Christians will like to get to that. Well, just because that happens, who cares? No big deal. Believe me, Darth's going to go there in this video. The issue is the amount of suffering. Why is there so much of it? Not that there isn't. The logical problem of evil, you'd probably get into like kind of a zero-sum game where should there be any or should there be none? And I'm very much generalizing and simplifying here, but the evidential problem of evil is the one that a lot of people get stuck on. It's one thing to say people get into accidents and fall down and get hurt, but they heal. That's one thing. But the amount of suffering that happens in the world, and not just to humans, but to all living things, is an issue that is difficult for Christians to deal with.
These very distasteful things that human beings dislike, because it will facilitate God maximizing the number of freely people through the course of human history who decide that they want to seek him and be right with him and not love this present world.
I'm going to play this part
If
again.
God maximum things that benevolent of God's righteous judgment,
here we go.
in creation, there was no suffering. The suffering is a display of God's righteous judgment. Now, it is benevolent that God allows these very distasteful things that human beings dislike, because it will facilitate God maximizing the number of freely people through the course of human history who decide that they want to seek him and be right with him and not love this present world.
So there's the first mechanism, right? So Darth is already setting up a narrative in which the suffering that somebody would point out and talk about, that's not really a problem, because what's actually happening here is God has created this world and provided people with freedom, and the suffering that comes into it is something that God permits, because humans are going to make decisions and they're going to get hurt and they're going to go the wrong way. But the suffering that they have to endure, sort of the consequences of their decisions, that's going to maximize the number of people that turn to God later. So if you make God makes this current reality a difficult and painful one to maximize the number of people that will seek him and ask him for forgiveness so that he can save them. Think about what Darth's doing there, and think about what else you know about Christianity and where this might start kind of butting up against other concepts that Christians hold.
If human suffering or the unpleasantries of life during the course of human history were reduced significantly, fewer people would take the afterlife and judgment day with God seriously.
So here's another claim. So he's basically reinforcing the first part. If the world was a cozy, comfortable place filled with pleasure, and there was an eradication of suffering, or a drastic, it was minimized to the extent that God can minimize it, or maybe it's eradicated completely, people wouldn't take forgiveness seriously. They wouldn't take God's grace seriously. They have to suffer in order to turn to God. I think in the comments to this particular video, I think it was Michael Deaton wrote, the beatings will continue until morale improves. That's a pretty good summary of where Darth's going with this.
We have a perfect example of this in the pre-flood world, where people were rampantly evil. Okay. And so in the pre-flood creation, people lived longer. There wasn't as much suffering. People had greater longevity, right? But they became complacent. So the suffering that we
It doesn't say that they became complacent. It says they became evil, right? And actually, their lives were reduced. Their lifespans, I believe, in Genesis 6, where it kind of sets up the beginning, where God starts seeing that they're multiplying, they're producing, but their hearts are set for all they do is evil all the time. Right? I think their lifespan is reduced to 150 or 120, right? Which really isn't that much different from what we've got. I mean, it's still fantastical and odd. God just like puts the clock on human life at that point and then decides to kill everybody. Right. But at the same time, there's the passage in that where it talks about the sons of God. Most Christians, it was angels or fallen angels descending to earth and having sex with the daughters of men and producing, and this was, of course, an abomination. This needs to stop, right? So Darth is on shaky ground, I think, anytime he talks about like the flood, right? Because one of the issues with that is that everybody's evil, but God decides that Noah is righteous and his family. And now nowhere in the story does it say that no, it says Noah's a righteous man. So I guess we're supposed to understand that if Noah is a righteous man in the eyes of Darth, not in the eyes of God, but in the eyes of Darth, based on the narrative, Noah is this guy that understands that people suffer in this world because suffering leads to God, right? Or at least he may not explicitly understand that, but that's rolling around in the back of his head. You need to be thankful for God, thankful for your existence, give thanks to Him, be willing to seek Him, throw yourself upon His mercy, and present yourself for His righteous judgment, unequivocally, all this kind of crap. That's the kind of righteousness I think Darth would say that's evident in Noah. Apparently, it was only in Noah. Everyone else is going to get flooded out. Right? That's an enormous amount of suffering on this physical plane. But keep in mind that there's supposed to be an afterworld where you go to, a place of permanent reward, heaven, and a place of perpetual torture, suffering, and punishment, hell. Now, some people don't believe in hell as eternal conscious torment, but Darth definitely does. So why is any of this suffering necessary? And this, I think, is one of the questions that a lot of Christian apologists, they'll get distracted and talk, well, suffering's not that big a deal, and they'll do the same kind of thing that Darth will do. Well, if you suffer a little bit, then you realize this world is bad and you need to turn to God. Yeah, maybe. But is that really necessary? This claim that Darth makes in order to support the idea, like, well, God couldn't make it super nice and super cozy because then people would become complacent and they won't do anything. Well, it's not apparent in Genesis that that's what's happening. Right? People have been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So toil is hard. Women giving birth is hard. All that stuff is supposed to be taking place then and there. Now, unless you're you have some weird beliefs where, the severity of suffering and for man increased, God rolled it out in stages like uploads or something, then okay, maybe. But the basic idea behind this is that, according to Darth, it can't be too nice because then nobody will like it. Darth could roll out salvation like a drug. And like a drug dealer, you give somebody a taste of pleasure. They don't have to be in exquisite pain. You just give them a taste of something really sublime, something very, very intense. right? And then it wears off, and they're like, okay, now I'm just back to this. Now drugs probably aren't the greatest one because if you get addicted and go through withdrawal, the suffering is real, right? Anybody who's struggled with substance abuse disorders knows this. But the idea that you wouldn't want more of what you have is odd to me. Like you have to be deprived of good. You have to endure suffering in order to turn to God to get the good stuff, to get to have him give you, like, because he'll believe, Darth will lay out this later, I think. Evil is deprivation. So suffering is a deprivation of the good stuff, right? You need his mercy in order to make things cozy for you. Fine. That's one way of looking at it. But what makes you think that if people were living an already kind of comfortable life, that they wouldn't want more, and that God couldn't get them to focus on the fact that, yeah, this is a good life and you're living well and no one really suffers. Imagine how much better it's going to be in heaven. And I think Darth said, well, no, people would just get complacent about it. Well, how does he explain complacency now? People there's an enormous amount of suffering in the world, and people become complacent about God. So this doesn't really work automatically, at least not for me. So we'll see. They're going to get into this a little bit more, and Thurley's going to push back with questions.
Experience is a motivator not to love this present world. Now, your only objection to the suffering in this world is that if you were God, you would not incorporate that into your plan of creation. Other than that, you have no ability to object to what God permits.
Okay, so his language here is very. I don't think he's being as careful as he thinks he's being. So he's telling Thurley that his only objection is that God's doing things in a way that Thurley does not approve of or does not prefer, and Thurley doesn't have any grounds to criticize how it's being done. From Darth's worldview, that might have a point if you accept that particular being as being existing necessarily for whatever, basically be an inevitably existing being and creating things exactly the way they were meant to be. If that's the case, then sure. But for most atheists and most skeptics, God is taken, at least hypothetically, and for most of us, I think the biggest reason that we don't believe in God is because we think that God is made up. Right? We're more inclined to believe that God is a story invented by people, not an actual being who has done the things that believers claim that it's done. In a nutshell, I think that's basically it. From that perspective, from Thurley's worldview, he absolutely can argue with and contest and point out where this particular being might be inconsistent in its application of its plan. There's nothing wrong with that from a skeptic worldview. So that claim right there from Darth Dawkins is like, well, you just don't like it because it's not how you prefer it. You don't have any place to say in Darth's worldview. He's trying to superimpose his values and his conclusions onto Thurley. And really, if he acknowledges the existence of other worldviews, and he's trying to make sure that he can keep that consistent external critique versus internal critique, he shouldn't be doing this. But Darth doesn't care about consistency.
So if let me ask you, Dawkins, if the suffering of humanity is merely a tool to push us towards divinity and Christianity and to push us towards wanting eternal life, what then is the benevolent function of damning human beings to eternal suffering in hell?
It's not.
So that's a good question, and notice what he said there, because I like the one bit that he brought up. Let me rewind it just a bit.
What then is the to push us towards divinity and Christianity and
yeah, that aspect of his question I think is interesting, because if you examine the way he asked it, he's like, okay, so he's pointing out Darth, the same thing I pointed out. Darth is pointing to suffering is necessary to push people towards seeking God for eternal life. I think that raises an interesting part. I don't think Darth grasps on it. Why would people be motivated for a reward of more life when the life granted to them here on Earth is filled with so much suffering and pain. You would end up getting people who end up taking a very different stance on it, where I don't want eternal life. I want to sleep forever. You get the people that seek oblivion, a cessation of existence. That will happen if you make the world, if you fill it with, like, it's one thing if you fill it with some tough things, some challenges, some things that people get over. It's one thing to pull a muscle and then kind of recover and then come back stronger and feel like you've accomplished something, that you've risen above that moment of weakness. It's another thing to lose your leg and then have to live the rest of your life with that handicap. Those are two very different things. And if you fill the world with missing limbs and maiming and diseases that not only kill but maim and cripple and harm in perpetuity for the rest of these people's natural lives, you create a reality where people will be inclined to seek the cessation of more life. So when somebody comes along and says, "Well, this God is granting immortality, he eternal life in paradise," well, it better be better than this shit. But that's not the Christian view, and that's not Darth's view. Darth's view is you're already immortal. Darth doesn't believe in this kind of like your body kind of contingency kind of thing. He believes you as a Christian, as a being created by God, are already immortal. You're just a soul in a meat bag. The meat bag has an expiration date, but your soul doesn't. Your soul has a destination determined by what you do with the meat bag on the limited amount of time he puts you in this torture box. And so if you do the right things, your soul gets yanked out of your meat bag, which, by the way, must be destroyed, according to Darth. He'll get into that later, must be destroyed in order for your soul to really excel and really ascend to its full potential. You get to go to the good place. If you don't do the right things with your meat bag in the torture box that God placed you in, your soul is ripped out. Your body's dying anyway, one way or the other. That check is cashed, right? That's getting taken care of. But your soul goes to a place of eternal conscious torment where you get to endure pain beyond imagining for the rest of existence, for all time. Not even the rest. To say the remainder is to presuppose that it's going to have an end. There's no end. That is not a good outlook on things.
And to push us towards wanting eternal life. What then is the benevolent function of damning human beings to eternal suffering in hell?
It's not a function of benevolence. You have a misconceptualization of the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is not a monolith of benevolence.
Okay, that's going to be a good point. Thank you, Dave. This is such a silly worldview that I feel like we're mocking it just by describing it. That's what I try to do best. I try to sum up Christianity as best I can and as concisely yet as comprehensively as I can, while trying not to load it up with too much loaded language, but with just enough stuff in there that just laying it out makes people either cross their eyes or push away from it like, nah, no, that's a shit sandwich. I don't want anything to do with it. Because I really think that it is. As any kind of, whether you approach Christianity as a mental discipline, if you're approaching it from a culture, as a cultural artifact or anything, I think there's a lot more wrong with it than right with it. And despite what some of that cultural interface that's happened over the hundreds of years that we've dealt with, that being a huge part of Western culture, I think you can recognize Christianity for some of the things that it's inspired people to do: the creation of different faith traditions, the creation of buildings, great works of art, great works of music. Then you have to ask yourself, would those things have been absent? Would that art and would that interaction with society and because culture and that kind of stuff, and those kinds of things, that's an interaction that humans have with each other. Would it be missing, or would it have just been transformed into something else? I think it would have been transformed into something else. I think people's output would have been different, but it still would have existed in some shape or form. So, but I can respect the fact that tradition exists and we have this. It's important to understand where it comes from. But I think it's really important to understand just how ludicrous it can get. Because if you don't pay attention to that, you're actually doing the traditions and its origin and those original ideas a huge disservice. There's nothing wrong with ridiculing a bad idea just because it's old and venerated. In fact, It's probably more respectful to give it a little derision and a little ridicule if it was so completely off the mark. No one really respects the heliocentric model of the universe, where, or not the heliocentric, the geocentric, where the Earth is the center of the solar system or the universe. No one gives that really any credit. It was a major influencing thing for people's minds, scientifically, artistically, whatever. It was something that people fixated on. It inspired people, but now we've discarded it because empirical science has proven otherwise. So that's over. We have better models for that, and now those we fixate on, those inspire. Right? It's important to know where we came from, and it's important to respect the fact that that was a development in human thought, but you don't have to fetishize it. So
he is also righteous and just. Okay, God must punish evil, otherwise.
But notice that God, first of all, Darth is laying out a weird distinction for God here. He's not a monolith for good. He's also just and righteous. No, the just and righteous part is a part of benevolence. If he wasn't just and he wasn't righteous, then he wouldn't be good. This is really kind of an odd thing. I don't know how Darth is actually I think Darth is actually fixating an idea where he thinks good is hugs and kisses and pleasant times all the time. But goodness, at least as far as God would do that, it would be justice and righteousness, right? He would do the right thing. He would make the right call. People that deserve to be punished would be punished. People that deserve to be forgiven would be forgiven. And he follows that up. God must punish. Yelp. And according to the omnibenevolence, God must forgive. Darth never emphasizes that part. God is all just and he is all merciful. That is the problem with the concept of omnibenevolence. Both those things are there. Darth has admitted that there is an antithesis. These things are antithetical to one another, and he has described to other people that Jesus solves this in some way, shape, or form. But here he's doing this again, and this is a common critique of mine. If anybody's watched my videos, Christians do this a lot. Darth does it explicitly. Emphasize God must punish. Christians have that beaten into them, and in probably every evangelical fundamentalist church across this country. I don't know how many churches are doing the opposite message because it's less common. And if you go to popular declarations and Christianity Today or any of these other kinds of things, you will not hear Christians harping on God must forgive you. Because if people start fixating on that idea, and it's totally consistent with the properties of the God they've described, that's why Jesus had to die for your sins, because God must forgive you. And it's not about your faith, it's about his faith to us. And that's a universalist message, which means which entails you don't have to do anything. It's not about your choice. It's not about your thought process. It's not about your decisions. It's not about you. It's all about that God working it out for itself. And that has implications that Christians are terrified of.
Otherwise, he won't be a righteous God.
If he's not, but he's also not a good God if he does not forgive. He must forgive. That's the other side of the coin. Actually, it's not even the other side of the coin. It's on the same page. He's omnibenevolent. He's perfectly just and perfectly merciful. That is the same as saying he must punish and he must forgive. Darth's leaving out the second part because punishment is how Christianity works. Christianity doesn't work without hell. It's like capitalism doesn't work without debt.
Okay. You see, people like you, because you have a piss poor understanding of the God of the Bible, always resort to talking about, oh, your God is benevolent, but look at all the bad stuff in the world. And you reason that there is an incompatibility between God being maximally benevolent and there being certain distasteful situations. So let me ask you this question. Is all suffering incompatible with God's being maximally benevolent and along with his other attributes?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so that's an interesting stance to take. And I actually kind of like this position because if he's going at this, keep in mind that a lot of guys like Darth Dawkins are fixated on the idea that God is necessary, like in logic, right? Like it exists necessarily. Keep in mind, though, and this is something that I kind of ran into while doing a little bit of philosophy review and reading. Necessary is one of those things. Even David Hume and other philosophers, a lot of philosophers to this day, necessary is something that is something that occurs within logic, right? But it doesn't necessarily apply to the real world. Hume believed that. There are many philosophers today also hold to that notion. A lot of these apologists don't care about that, right? As soon as you establish something as being like rhetorically necessary or logically necessary in one of their arguments, it must also be necessary in the real world, right? So if you're going to take on somebody like this, you might want to take on the logical problem of evil. And in that case, it would be one of those things where is any amount of suffering present in the world, is that consistent with the properties of an omnibenevolent God? I would think logically, no, right? Because theoretically, that God could create a world different than the one that he's already done. Darth will usually try to lean, and I've heard him make this kind of these arguments before. He almost leans into the fact, no, the world couldn't have been any different than the way it was made, right? He kind of gets, he really is kind of getting into necessitarianism, but he avoids accusations that he tries to weasel his way out of it. But that's what he gets into. The world is the way it is because it had to be that way because God, right? Everything flows from God, and it couldn't have been any other way. Right. But the suffering here that's happening here is some kind of, whether you think suffering is an additional evil plastered onto people that we have to deal with and conquer, or you think like Darth, that suffering and evil is a deprivation of the good, somehow or another, this reality was created with the addition of evil, which Darth can't ground because it can't come from God, or it's a deprivation of evil, a deprivation of good, which God is. But God's omnipresent and omnipotent and all-powerful and created the world in a way that could only exist this particular way. So where is this at? How do they account for an absence of good? How is God absent in anything? Now you start poking at that whole omnipotent part of God. This is what I mean when a lot of these properties become catastrophic, because as you start to try to flesh them out, they start blowing up.
Okay, so that do you know that pain is a signal that there's something wrong? Now, do you know what leprosy is?
Yes.
Okay, when people get leprosy, a frequent fallout of that is the cessation of pain in various parts of your body, which inevitably leads them to damaging their body parts. Did you know that?
Yes.
And so
Right, so now you have an example of someone who can suffer without feeling pain. Good job, Darth. Darth is already starting to chip away at his own defense for this. This is not good.
the experience of a certain amount of pain is a signal to stop whatever you're doing. Okay.
Sure.
Now he's going to appeal to kind of a naturalism argument, and this is where things get super cringe. We'll let this play out and then get into where I think this does not work for him.
Okay. So your position is that if you were God, you would eradicate all pain. But if you did that, that would mean that people would harm themselves without knowing it.
Well, if I was
No. Right. Now he's actually strawmanning an argument that Thurli has not given. Right? Because Thurli is the initial question that he asked Thurli was about suffering. Is any amount of suffering inconsistent with God's properties? And Thurli answered yes. And now Darth has shifted that to, oh, well, you're just talking about pain. Right? Now he hasn't said that explicitly, but now he's talking about pain. He is talking specifically about a pain issue because the example he's giving is one to misdirect this Thurli's contention, right? He hasn't asked Thurli to flesh out what he means by that. Darth is doing that for him and doing it completely wrong. So you can't even really say this is a straw man because Thurli hasn't really offered like an argument or anything for Darth to really strawman. He's just answered his question in the affirmative. Yes, it's inconsistent with God's properties that any suffering exists. And Darth is like, well, you know what? There's this thing called leprosy where you can damage your body because all your pain receptors are gone. So you'd want a world in which people don't feel any pain, and then they're ripping their fingers off and blowing up their joints and stuff, and they just continue to harm themselves because they don't feel any pain. They don't know any better. Is that the kind of world you want? Huh? Is it? Poke, poke, poke. Right. This is a stupid. This is the kind of like belligerent, dumb argument that you would give if a kid came back and like you're trying, like if you're an abusive Christian and you're trying to tell a skeptical 14-year-old why their take on suffering isn't right. Right. He's just reducing it to pain, and then doing this whole thing. Well, pain's just a signal, huh? It's and it's natural that we feel pain because that tells our bodies what to do. He's gonna double down on this.
If I was God, Dawkins, I wouldn't allow the harm to happen in the first place because I'm omnipotent.
Okay, right. So what you're all you're simply saying then is that if you were God, you're wiser than God right now. Are you wiser than God, or are you just saying you don't like God's plan?
Well, I never really made that statement, Dawkins. You're asking me if I was God, so I answered if I was God.
Yeah. So if
Yeah, so now he's got to get back into preference, probably. A death end. Yeah, this is good. God could have made a reaction without trauma. A world without defects and cancer and everything would have progressed just fine. Right. Hold that thought.
if you were God, so what? Who cares how you would run your world?
Well, it's interesting that Darth asked that. Who cares how you would run your world? That does matter if you're talking to a skeptic, and a skeptic is looking at God and evaluating it as a story. If you're a Christian and you're trying to convince a skeptic that God is more than just a myth, more than just made up, it's actually real, then it does matter what that skeptic thinks in terms of convincing them how they think the world should be run, because they have a problem with how things are run, and they have a problem with the properties as stated by God. Now, Darth is just being dismissive at this point because he's a lazy, codger. But if you're trying to actually minister to people, which as a Christian he's supposed to be doing, then what he needs to do is figure out how this young man, Thurli, has a misapprehension or is not comprehending the way the world is supposed to be run. Like all Darth has given him is, that beginning like blurb about no, God has to make the world a suffer box in order for you to understand that you need him. Okay. That I believe is the same kind of, that's sort of Hellraiser logic, right? The kind of God that he's painting for, and at least the one that I'm summoning up in my mind is Pinhead showing up with his lament configuration and just telling people that their suffering will be legendary. Shoving a sword through his cheeks or twisting a nipple or something, something grotesque. But that's all I'm seeing is a sadomasochistic hell dimension demon. But okay, so now he's already starting to get frustrated, and we're not that far into this, only 5 minutes. But who cares what you think, Thurli? Who cares how you think the world should be running? Well, you're supposed to give a shit, Darth, because you're talking to a skeptic, and if you want to convince this kid that your view on this is right, you might want to care about how he comprehends the world around him and how he's apprehending the story being laid out in the Christian faith.
Okay.
Now, as I said, God displayed his benevolence in creation so that when God temporally judged the world, for example, is people dying? If people died absolutely pain-free, right? Would that be inconsistent with God's benevolence?
I mean, are we talking about death in terms of a suffering?
If somebody's biological existence ceases to
You're welcome, Judy.
exist, 1 second you're here, the next minute you're gone.
Hang on. This is good.
Of a suffering?
If somebody's biological existence ceases to exist.
If someone's biological existence ceases to exist, you want to come up with an even dumber way to say that, Darth? That's a challenge. If you're listening, it's a challenge for you or any of your minions. Any Darth fans that, if you have his ear, take that back to him. Ask him if he can come up with a more convoluted and stupid way to say that.
1 second you're here, the next minute you're gone.
Sure.
Is that inconsistent with God's benevolence?
Well, no, because I don't really see death as a suffering.
Okay, good. So what all you're just simply saying is the cessation, that only.
Exactly. I am a big fan, at least of the movies. I've only read two of the books. It's like watching a Tolkien fanboy desperately trying to explain why they couldn't just ride the Eagles all the way to the volcano. It is a good point. Lots of big plot holes in the Tolkien ones, and most of the stuff that in order to explain it away, it's explained away with mystery or magic or just so story. It's whatever. Yeah, if you take it on, if you take it as a guy building his own myth, all right. But like a lot of myths, lots of things wrong with it.
Only pain. So is all pain incompatible with benevolence?
Yes.
That's absurd. That's like saying that an automobile manufacturer who has red lights on your dashboard, when a red light comes up, it's a signal that there needs to be a correction.
Okay.
That's ridiculous.
That's a great line. Darth sells propane and propane accessories. Thanks for that, JL. I think we're catching JL on a breakfast rush. Yeah. And notice what he's saying here. What was that last little point
There
that he
are
made?
all
because
different. Listen carefully.
Okay, so now he's gonna dig into this a little bit more. He's going to make an appeal to something that a lot of people who tend to be naturalists, that Darth hates, right? He doesn't like the evolutionists, are going to don't have a problem with, right? And the individual that from above said, an evolutionary worldview shows why, can kind of account for suffering and explains why suffering is there. A Christian worldview has a little bit harder time kind of taking that into account without, and I agree, it has a harder time taking into account without larding it up with all this kind of, well, you need to, it's character building stuff. There's all these theodicies to explain it. This party is going to basically try to go into this, and this feels like a cynical attempt. Like, well, isn't pain? Don't you silly naturalist materialist, don't you know that pain is a signal that our body is recognizing there's damage done to the body, and it needs something needs attention, or it needs to be addressed? Part of it. But here's the problem: in medicine, pain also can also become a dysfunction very quickly. In fact, most of what medicine ends up, especially when you start getting into what more invasive medicine, the stuff that really changes lives, like surgeries and stuff, you have to work around the body's natural inclination, because your body doesn't simply, it's not like a car giving you a check engine light. Your body loses its shit, right? And it affects your brain, right? And the reason that you do that, there's lots of different evolutionary explanations for why that probably is the case. If you torque a finger out and you feel that kind of pain, your body tightens up because now your body's become weak. Maybe it's a defense mechanism. You get hard, your muscles stiffen up because you don't want to take any more damage. But a lot of that is just as damaging, and over time, if not mitigated, can become just as damaging as the initial wound or the initial injury or the initial infection. So some of those things have to be mitigated. Even in certain infections, you don't allow a high fever to just run its course because, well, that's just the immune system killing off the virus. Yeah, but it's also going to damage other bodily tissues if you don't do something to kind of control that. The body can overdo it, and when it comes to pain, it often does. And a lot of what pain management is in medicine is about basically trying to you're trying to circumvent the body's natural process to lose its shit when something physically changes in a way that it can't, that's beyond homeostasis, right? That's the point, right? So even things like scarring, scarring is going to lead to a possible, just from an injury, is going to lead to a lack of mobility, possibly more pain down the road. There are things that you can do medically in advance to prevent that from happening, because the body's natural course of action is to kind of turn that area into a tree limb. And that's what nature's going to do. You don't want nature to fully take its course. You want to take steps to and like, okay, this is what's going to happen. We need to mitigate some of that so we can keep the tissue pliable. We can keep it moving. The best example, hand injuries. If you break a hand or do anything to that, anybody who's been through occupational therapy for hands, if you've gotten that argument or the talk, the lecture from occupational therapists, when they talk about hand damage, it's the one thing that they hate. It's bad. If you injure your hand in a way and then keep it stiff and keep it immobile, your hand will turn into a T-Rex claw. It doesn't take hardly any time at all. all those tendons, you lose an enormous amount of flexibility, you lose range of motion, you lose strength, and it all happens very, very quickly. So the counterintuitive thing to do, you want to hold it still and never move it so you don't feel that pain anymore. That's the natural reaction. You actually have to go against that. You have to find a way to keep the hand mobile while you're trying to heal it, to deal with the injury itself. So pain isn't just like this. This is like pain is a virtue. It's just the check engine light for people. And if we didn't have it, we'd be like lepers walking around, knocking bits and pieces of ourselves off and bleeding to death all over and just not caring. No, it's not one or the other. And wait for him to drop that nugget because it's coming up here.
There's all different degrees of sensation, discomfort, and pain. Okay? And so pain can serve a very useful function so that human beings do not harm themselves. So your position is either going to have to be that all pain is bad and incompatible with benevolence, or just that some pain is. So which is it?
So now he's getting into like some pain or all pain, right? Because now, keep in mind, and I think Thurli kind of loses track of this, right? The initial setup for this was about suffering. Darth went to pain. Darth took suffering and went to pain with it. And that's not all there is to suffering. Not entirely.
I've already made my position clear on this. I think all pain is incompatible with benevolence in the fact that...
How is it incompatible with benevolence? How?
Well, because if a god is the ultimate, okay, then they would have the ultimate ability to cease all like potential suffering.
You're not understanding. There is a wide range of physical sensation. Okay.
Of course.
Now, okay, in its most minute amount, it would just simply be a sensation. Then it can move to a level of just a barely discernible discomfort. And
then that's why if you're talking about suffering in terms of the problem of evil, and somebody like a theist wants to convert suffering over to you as a secularist, a skeptic, an atheist, you're just obsessed with people getting hurt and people hurting. It's not just about physical pain. That's not all suffering is, right? It's also the suffering of others. Right, can have huge effects on how we live. I can live a completely healthy life dealing with the kind of the pain, quote unquote, that Darth's talking about. Occasionally, I stub my toe, I hurt my back. All right, put some heat on it, do whatever, you'll be fine. Walk it off, right? But I could be living in an environment where a lot of people are getting sick, or getting injured, or are malnourished, or are depressed, or dealing with substance abuse disorders. That causes an enormous effect on my life. I may not be physically feeling any pain at all, but now I suffer because I live in a community with other people who are all suffering. And that suffering kind of splashes back on other people. It causes everything to get a little shittier. The fact that Darth is just this is just you being fixated with pain and people having owies and stuff. No, ding dong. That's not what's meant by that. And again, we're just kind of dealing with whether or not pain should be there logically or not, based on the properties of God. We're not even dealing with where people really get stumped, which is, why is there so much suffering? Why is there just heaps and heaps of it? Right? It's more than just a check engine light at that point.
And then it can increase in intensity. You're saying that even the most minute sensation that is barely discernible as discomfort is incompatible with benevolence.
No, you started them down that path because you converted suffering to pain. You were the one that turned it into that. Thurli hasn't pushed back on that.
All you're just simply saying is it's incompatible with benevolence because you wouldn't do it. You haven't given me a logical argument how God be.
That's not it either. The criticism from most of these things about the problem of evil is not based on I wouldn't do things the way God does them. It's given the way God is described, given the properties he's said to have, the power he's said to possess, the knowledge he possesses, it seems inconsistent given those properties that he would behave in this way, that he would allow, permit, design, build things, however you want to put it, this way. It's not about how I want it done. I'm being told a story about a God that does A, B, and C and is X, Y, and Z. Okay, great. Why would it do things this way, given its abilities, given its knowledge, given its nature? How are you going to square that? Telling someone, oh, this just isn't, just because God's not living up to your preferences doesn't mean he's not real. That's all Darth's trying to do here. That's not the argument.
Being benevolent. Okay. I'm sure that had not the fall occurred, that Adam or Eve and their posterity, had not they not fallen into sin, would have experienced mild discomfort, which serves as a signal to avoid injury.
See?
So all you're just simply saying.
Darth laid out right there that he believes that it was possible that if Adam and Eve had not violated their contract with God and had not sinned, then the existence that they would have, and all humans as their posterity would have had, is an existence where we don't experience pain and suffering like Darth described, but we're not the lepers that he described either. So he just basically negated his whole first part, the whole part about, well, you need pain, otherwise you'll just walk around and you'll rip a finger off and bleed to death like a leper. Like, you wouldn't even know. No. And you just said that you can. Darth has basically conceded that that there is a possible world that God could have created, that God did create, and if Adam and Eve had simply stuck to the original plan, we would be able to register damage to our bodies, but it wouldn't be pain as we know it, the suffering that we know it. And you know what? I don't know why Darth is even having a problem with this, because a lot of what he was trying to explain before, well, you have to have this kind of pain, otherwise it wouldn't work. Eve didn't have that kind of pain when it came to childbirth. God added that on. It says that right in Genesis. Now she's going to experience pain with her labors. And we know that from our own. I mean, it's not just pain. Childbirth can kill women. It does kill women. It kills too many women. That's something that God did.
Thing is, you reason that it's incompatible, but you haven't showed how various minute levels.
You haven't showed. I'm not going to dive too deep on that. Haven't showed. Work on your verb tenses, Darth.
Of discomfort or even minute levels of pain are incompatible with benevolence.
He's not saying that minute levels of pain are incompatible with benevolence. You took suffering, went in that direction, and then blew that up. I mean, this is astoundingly bad. I don't know if he hadn't been caffeinated or something like, but even for Darth, this is a weak argument. I think it's because this Thurli guy. This is actually kind of a good example. If you're like Thurli and you don't push back too much, and you let Darth do a lot of talking, it gives somebody like me an opportunity to listen to Darth say a lot of stuff, and it's just more things he can get wrong. And he does not disappoint in getting things wrong.
You haven't demonstrated that.
Can I ask you a question quickly, Dawkins? What?
Okay. Okay. I would, before you do.
Yes.
Do you concede or not concede that you haven't shown that there's an incompatibility in what I just said? You're just saying it's incompatible because you wouldn't do it.
Yeah, sure. I would. Yeah, I would concede that.
And that's a good point. Childbirth is the most dangerous thing a woman naturally does, but according to Christians, it's what we're created to do. Yeah, you're created to take on that risk, despite the fact that it was specifically in their book, especially the way the biblicists, the fundamentalists, take it. In the beginning of the narrative, God made it so that you will experience pain and difficulties with child labor. The interesting word that's left out when he says that is death. That's left out of Genesis. Like, oh, it's going to be stressful, laborious, painful. You will suffer when you give birth to kids. It kills women. It's interesting that the Bible doesn't mention the part that they could die, and yet Christians are like, no, that's your lot in life, is to play that game of Russian roulette and just hope that God is benevolent enough to not allow all the terrible things that can go wrong with your body occur when you give birth. And you're not just going to do it once. That would be selfish of you. Don't just have one. It's not one and done. God opens and closes the womb, don't you know? No birth control. Sorry, I'm going to go off on too many tangents if I start with that.
So there's no logical incompatibility with pain in general and God being benevolence.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about the physical sensation of pain, sure, but I'm also
Good.
talking
Okay.
about
So
the
now,
ability
so
to
now you're going
suffer.
to have to change your argument. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, let me ask you a question, Dawkins. Do you think
I love that. You're going to have to change your argument. He didn't give an argument, Darth. You asked him a question and he responded, and then you provided him an argument that he didn't do anything with, and then went on to say how it was wrong. And now you're telling him that he needs to change his argument. Th- This is this is brilliant work, Darth. Really, congratulations.
do you think extremely poor, materially deprived children in Africa, when the Ebola virus sprung, these children were basically bleeding like blood and pus out of every
Yeah.
orifice? Like,
This
do you
isn't
think this is?
this is an emotional argument, sir. Do you
Yes, I
realize
know.
that?
Yes,
Okay.
because
All you're
we are
simply
humans.
listen. All you're simply doing is you're repeating your same line of reasoning, but giving me illustrations, okay, of suffering. Okay. The fact of the matter is, right, either you're going to say that all suffering is incompatible with benevolence, or you're going to have to say it's not all incompatible, that only some forms of it are. Okay. So are you relinquishing your claim that all discomfort is incompatible with God being benevolent?
I'm. I think. Yeah, I would agree that all pain it does not present a contradiction within
Good.
God's
So now,
benevolence.
now you're only left with throwing out that
But
high intensities of pain.
well,
Nope. So I think I want to say that Thurley, I think at this point has kind of gotten himself into a little bit of trouble, but he didn't get himself in. He didn't take them there. Darth did. So the only thing Thurley really had the opportunity to do, I think, at this point, would be to, once he gets a tiny opportunity to speak, would be to push back on this definition that Darth did. Darth childishly just took suffering and converted it over to pain and made it all about people feeling physical pain. Like he hasn't even talked about depressive disorders, mental health issues, the kind of suffering that I mentioned too, like societal suffering, the suffering that otherwise healthy people end up having to, that they endure because they're surrounded by a lot of sick people, right? That I mean, the suffering and pain and stuff like that happens with other, like it draws. Look at the pandemic. Even if you're a medical provider and you don't happen to catch and you didn't catch COVID, look at the suffering they're enduring attempting to provide care for all the people flooding into the hospitals and clinics and have been doing so over the past 2 years. That's shared suffering, right? It's not pain. It's not just an owie. It's not your own body, right? Darth went there. And now he's trying to say, like, oh, so now basically you're just relegated to talking about the really bad stuff that really super hurts you. No, no. It doesn't have to be that. Thurley hasn't really had an opportunity to do that. Now he's basically saying, no, I don't think it's all pain is inconsistent with this God. I do. I think that when Thurley started out with this, if you're sticking with kind of that logical division, any pain, if it's worth calling it that, like pain derived from kind of the when we think of pain in the sense that I'm being punished for something, my body hurts because something's wrong, that kind of pain, feeling that kind of pain from this kind of guy with those kind of properties logically doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to fit. If you're going to take it from an evidentialist side or this kind of naturalistic explanation, the kind of stuff that Darth's doing is just horseshit, right? I can explain away small amounts of pain and intense amounts of pain from an evolutionary perspective. It makes sense as natural creatures that we will feel these things, right? There's no God to blame it on, right? There's no Superman to save you. But from a religious perspective, it ceases to make sense, especially if suffering's not a glitch. It's a feature of the universe. And so Darth is going to continue to strawman this a little bit, and I think like Thurley doesn't really have an opportunity to really air anything out. And Darth's not the kind of person who will do what Thurley has done. Thurley has let Darth talk and let him laid out a lot of shit. Darth could have done this with Thurley. If Thurley was really on the wrong track, Darth could just be patient and let Thurley try to explain out what his view is on this, and then try to pick that apart. But Darth is too busy trying to jump on every single perceived shortcoming from his perspective as soon as it happens, and not allowing things to unfold and happen in context. So he's not really criticizing anything here, The only thing he's arguing with at this point is himself. He could be having this conversation with himself.
Well, I
Okay.
would just like to say that some forms of suffering that are displayed on this earth are not just nor coherent within.
Okay, yeah. No, then all you're just saying is it's not just because you wouldn't do it that way.
Okay.
Okay, so do you have an external standard of justice that would be independent of God and independent of you just simply declaring that it's unjust? Is there an external standard as to what justice is? What justice is?
Isn't that what Darth is referring?
Yeah, it's what society deems just and fair.
That's not.
But when Darth talks about justice, right? What is just in Darth's mind, right? Is he comparing? If he's dealing with a skeptic who believes in a sense that justice is something that are things that we conclusions about how things should happen, ideas about ethics and justice, and who should be punished for doing what, and what constitutes a wrongdoing. All right, that's an external source. We can come to an agreement on those kinds of things, and we do. Those are different than what God would have. Justice, in terms of what I think Darth would hold to, is just, it's just if it's what God wants. It's unjust if it's not what God wants. You're not just. This is an important point. You're not just because you do something God wants. You're not a righteous person, even when you do a righteous act, if you're not a believer. Christians hold to this, and I believe Darth holds to that concept too. So he's also into some shaky ground here, but I'm going to play this for a while. Let this roll out.
That's arbitrary, sir. Where'd you get that value structure from? Where'd that come from?
From how I was brought up and the values that
Do you
I
know
was taught.
do you know what a hierarchy of values is?
Like Maslow's?
No.
No, sorry, about sneeze.
No. I'm not talking about Maslow's hierarchy of values. Okay, I'm just talking about everybody. Human being has a hierarchy of values. So we value some things. Like, for example, if you value getting a new computer, you'll spend the money. If you don't, you'll save your money. Okay, so every time we make a choice, when we make choices, we value one state of affairs versus another. So that's a hierarchy of values. Okay. So when you talk about justice, you're just saying justice is whatever conforms to either your or a plurality of persons' hierarchy of values. So why does the hierarchy of values of a plurality? How is that? All you're just appealing is to human thinking.
Well, I'm merely just saying that the amount of suffering on Earth is unnecessary to drive humans towards divinity.
Okay, no, okay, but that's an opinion that you can't justify. And by the way, we don't say drive toward stability. The bottom line is this: God has revealed that everything that He does is just and righteous and good. Okay, now, but you're coming along and you're saying, no, the God of the Bible is a liar. Okay, now, can you demonstrate that the God of the Bible is a liar? That the suffering that He permits during the course of human history, okay, is incompatible with his properties. Can you rationally justify that? Or is simply your just argument that you want to give tear-jerking emotional examples of little children in Africa who may be experiencing pain and even may die in a very early stage of their life, that it's simply incompatible with your hierarchy of values? Okay, so all you're just simply saying.
I love how dismissive Darth Dawkins is about human life, especially the lives of kids. Right? If someone brings them out, he will not be taunted or baited into these emotional arguments, right? Because that's just somebody trying to set him up as a bad guy or something. Which, let's face it, nobody has to set him up as a bad guy. He does a great job of that himself. But I wanted to pause it there because he's trying to get into this idea. So he's asking this kid, like, how would you go about doing this? You don't have to appeal to a plurality of values, as he put it, a consensus on justice, in order to point out the inconsistency of the kinds of justice you think you should expect from a God that does these kinds of things. Like, it doesn't have to do with what you've decided, is right or wrong in a society or amongst a plurality. It's based on the properties that God is said to have, and what rationally should follow from that, the entailment of those properties, how that informs how this thing acts, what it does. If there's contradictions there, that's where this starts to arise, right? And one of the biggest contradiction is, if Darth is one of these kinds of people that wants to do the kind of thing, God allows suffering. I think that's the wrong way for Christians to do this. If you want a strong position on this, the best way to do this is God loves suffering, and he needs you to endure it. That's necessary. Suffering is good, right? Life is suffering, life is pain. It was designed that way by God. It is good for you. It's good that you suffer, and that's what's necessary, right? That would be a better, I think, theological theodicy. And I think there are theodicies that go this way, that the problem of suffering isn't a problem because suffering is actually God's plan. I don't think Christians embrace that one because it makes it extremely hard. If you say that, right, then the idea is like, well, wait a minute, why would God create people only to have them live out this way, right? Then you end up having to get it. Well, God didn't. The suffering that man experienced has been brought on upon them by themselves. We sinned, and now we're dealing with the consequences of it. But we're not. That's another contradiction. This is when the story starts breaking apart. So, if humanity is going to be punished, if your soul is going to be sent to a place of eternal punishment because of what Adam and Eve did and the sinful nature of humanity, why do you need to suffer now? Darth's answer: because if you don't suffer now, you won't be as receptive to the redemption message that comes from God. Neat. But why is that important? The only reason that's important is because implicitly built into what Darth's talking about, the most important aspect of you don't get saved unless you want to. You have to be talked into it. And that's why you have to live in a world that's filled with suffering and bad, because you have to come to the conclusion in your mind that you need God and you need to ask him for forgiveness and you need to go to him and acknowledge that he's the only one that can save you. Why is that important? When Jesus saves you. Jesus did that. Jesus came here. He suffered. He died. He's resurrected. He defeated death. Why do we continue to suffer now? He took care of that. And yet these guys are still fixated on it's about you. It's about you making the right choice. And why is Darth fixated on that? Because if you make the wrong choice, you're bad, and he can tell you you're bad, and he can punish you, and he can smile in all of his hate and impotent rage. That's what he wants. He wants people to suffer. He wants punishment. His God is about it. He's about it. His whole approach is about it. He's a punishment fetishist. That's it. And his dogmatic approach is entirely about that. It's so far into that the gospel message of Jesus is missing from this Christian's viewpoint. He is not a Christian. As far as I'm concerned, this is not a Christian viewpoint at all. This is something else. This is I mean, at this point, he might as well be telling people this is no different than people suffering a drought and then taking their livestock and their crops and throwing them in the volcano to appease, fire god, whatever, to bring their crops back the next season. This is no different than that. They go through a hardship. You recognize God was displeased. You provide him with something, some propitiation. He then rewards you. This is primitive nonsense that Darth is trafficking in, and Darth loves it because he believes in carrot and stick relationships, those kinds of basic transactional, and he likes the abusive kind, and he's obsessed with punishment.
Saying is, little children in Africa who are suffering and even may die of an early age is incompatible with your hierarchy of values. But your hierarchy of values is just simply your arbitrary opinion. Do you realize that?
Is it necessary for these children to die?
Did I just ask you a question?
Sure, ask me the question.
Is it necessary? Yeah, it's necessary for everybody.
Ask him a question. Thoroughly ask to clarify. Didn't I ask you a question? Like, yeah, ask it. Okay. And then now he's going to answer his question. Is it necessary
to
for kids
die
die?
for
Yeah.
God to fulfill his plan of redemption. Because unless
See, your kid has to die in order for God to fulfill his plan of redemption. Now, why is that, Darth?
you die, you will have to go to hell in your current body. In order to
Well,
die, listen carefully.
okay,
The
sure.
way God designed human beings, okay, we have a spirit or a soul that is intertwined with a physical body. We inherit a sinful nature through biological reproduction. Now, that disposition, along with its accompanying behavior, must be eradicated by God. It must be destroyed or separated by God in terms of his justice. The only way for that to be accomplished, okay, is through in God's plan, is through by physical death. And then that's why the Bible teaches that when we're born again and God gives us a new disposition, we're the same person, but we have a new disposition. When we die, that old disposition will go away. So without physical death in God's plan, there won't be salvation.
Okay, so Darth is laying out quite a bit of the meat of some of his beliefs here, and that's why I thought this one was pretty good. But to address this, JL, have you noticed more people are taking the Pine Creek approach with Darth? Just concede a point to get him to talk about his position. Yeah, and I think that's one of the best, as far as like presuppositionals go. That's the best contribution that Pine Creek has provided to this tiny weird group of wannabe apologists and their skeptics, critics like me, was that kind of take on it. But getting back to what Darth's talking about here, so now he's talking about something that is this isn't really, well, maybe this is inside baseball. This is where things in Christianity get a little shaky. It's how they believe. Like, it's one thing like, okay, well, I'm born again and I'm saved. What happens when Jesus comes back? What happens when God comes back? What, am I physically resurrected? What happens here? Darth's laying out some interesting concepts here, right? He's saying that your physical body. This starts off with Thurli asking a question about the necessity of children suffering and dying, right, or just dying early, right? And Darth has now zagged off into this territory where he's going to be like, well, here's the thing: your body has to be physically separated away from your soul. Who says? Paul doesn't say that in the New Testament. Now, some of the ones not written by Paul probably have, like Ephesians and Colossians say some interesting things, but Ephesians and Colossians were very likely not written by Paul. But Ephesians and Colossians serve as two huge pillars for a lot of contemporary Christian thought and theology. But if you read the 7 letters from Paul, the ones that scholars are convinced, yep, those ones were written by Paul. For better or worse, if you look at his layout, God was coming back within Paul's generation. He was going to show up. Paul believed he was going to show up before Paul died. That's why his message was about this immediacy, right? There's a different immediacy to his ministry than there is now. He was an apocalyptic preacher too. And he's telling people that this guy's going to come back. He writes to the church in Thessalonians, in 1 Thessalonians, who are concerned that, you know what, we believe you, and we're waiting for Jesus, but some of the people, some of our fellow travelers have already died. Do they get to enjoy the kingdom of heaven upon Christ's return? And he said, yes. Paul wrote them back and was like, yes, they will be physically raised, and lays out this whole scheme where you are physically brought back to life upon Christ's return. And I think it's actually at that point where you will be raised into the sky. We will meet him halfway, right? And we will be made physically, just as Jesus was bodily resurrected, we will be bodily resurrected. What's Darth talking about here? Your body has to burn so that your soul can thrive in heaven or suffer for all eternity in hell. That is not Pauline Christianity. So what the hell is he doing?
So because you want to eradicate physical death, that means God cannot and will not facilitate his.
See you, jail. Have fun. Enjoy your time. Try to stay out of trouble. Try to stay out of jail. Not that there's any. I know that you guys will be safe. You'll be fine. There's no risk of jail. Just kidding. Bad joke. Sorry, YouTube. Enjoy, and yeah, I hope Irish Demon is having a good time despite his layover in Atlanta. Yeah, layovers in airports are a bummer, but hopefully he's liking it here.
His plan of salvation.
Well, let me ask you this, Dawkins. If you do believe then it is necessary for these children to die, why is it that these children die from these horrible?
Stop right
Hold on.
there.
No. I would like to ask my question for you, Dawkins.
You can ask your question in a second. You're repeating this.
Darth's not going to let him ask a new question, and now he's going to accuse him of asking something.
Same thing
repeating
over
himself.
again. Notice how you're appealing to children. Notice how you didn't talk about little 98-year-old lady in a nursing home who just died, who has constipation and then just dies. Notice it's appeal to children.
I'm appealing to children because it's relevant for the next question.
That's an emotional argument, sir.
I'm asking because it's relevant to the next question.
No, it's not relevant.
This question.
No, it is no. Listen to me carefully.
Okay, let me.
You're not listening to me. Okay, yeah, listen to me carefully. It's not relevant because when you make an appeal to little children, this is an emotional argument because little.
So what if it is? Right. That's one of the points of it, right? Like, and if Darth wanted to avoid this, he could have, if he gave a shit, he could have made the distinction. Like, what are we going to talk about? We're going to be talking about logical problems of evil. We're going to be talking about the logical problem of suffering, or logical problem of evil, or we're going to talk about like the evidential problem of evil, evidential problem of suffering. How are we going to lay this out, right? If you're going to talk about the evidential one, it does end up getting into a lot of emotional arguments because people are pointing to the sheer amount of suffering that humans endure, right? So Darth has whittled this down, already whittled that portion of it down. If they were going to have an evidential take on it, he's just said that, oh, you're just fixated on individual human pain. And Thurli really hasn't pushed up against that. He's just sort of working within the confines of what Darth is giving him, right? Again, because Darth's just having this conversation mostly with himself, and he's just using Thurli as a foil, which is what he does. But if he was having a logical one, which is, I think, where Thurli kind of started, when Thurli made that answer to that question, is it inconsistent for God, given his nature, to allow for any of this kind of suffering that we see? Thurli's answer was yes. And from a logical, from some of the takes on the challenges that come from the logical problem of evil, that's pretty consistent with it. I've already probably repeated this too much. So now Darth is he's getting ticked off that there's this emotional quotient to these to these arguments. Why is that inappropriate? It isn't a return to God, an acknowledgement that you need God's help, you need to repent, and you need to cast yourselves at the mercy of the Lord, and repentance and humility and servility, and recognize that you need his salvation. Otherwise, you're looking at an eternity of constant torment and suffering. Isn't that an emotional argument too?
Little children, by people who don't have a biblical view, are deemed to be innocent. Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is, the Bible says even children are not innocent. They're just in a pre-neurological development, just waiting to commit evil and sin. So
a kid is just a sinner waiting to happen, right? Okay, well, fine. Now that raises an interesting question that someone should ask Darth. Any of the kids when a child is electively, a pregnancy is electively terminated, or a woman has a miscarriage, I'm sure he probably believes that conception is life, right? So that's an individual waiting to happen. There's a soul on board, pre-installed, ready to go. Does that soul go to hell? After all, it's just a sinner waiting to happen. And is it just to pre-punish things? Is it if you know in advance, it sort of gets into like the whole, like if you were sent back in time, is it morally right for you to kill Adolf Hitler as a baby? Is it just to pre-punish someone for sins you know that they will commit?
Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is, you shouldn't talk about children. You should just talk about humans.
The interesting thing about that is that if Christians would be like, well, maybe you have a duty to. You have a duty to kill Adolf Hitler as a baby because you know all the bad things that he's going to do, and that's the position God's in. Okay, so then God knows exactly what's going to happen to everybody that he creates, and he knows some of them are destined to be shitbags, and so he kills them and sends their souls to hell. How is that just when he could have he opens and closes the womb? He creates people for a purpose. They're not happening incidentally. So why not just not create them? Why create them for the purpose of destruction and perpetual suffering and torment later on? How is that just? How is that good?
Because otherwise, you're just making an emotional argument.
So what, Darth? So what? Telling people that they need to turn to God, the thing coming right at them, the number one thing that you should fear, is the thing that you should cast yourself down upon and beg to help you. How is that not an emotional argument too?
Dawkins, so like the base of my next question is simply this, okay? If these children die, okay, why is it that God doesn't allow these children to show true salvation throughout the whole of their lives?
Stop with the children routine. That's an
Well,
emotional.
no.
Why did you talk about a 15-year-old?
Okay, you're not listening to my question, Dawkins. My question.
It is irrelevant. Listen carefully. It is irrelevant what their age is. It's irrelevant.
Well, okay, Dawkins, why?
Then it shouldn't matter when we kill people. It doesn't matter when people die, right? So why is abortion the emotional issue that it is for so many Christians? Well, you're not allowing that life is granted them by God, and it's God's duty to, God has will decide their fate. Right, their fate was to get aborted, and because they're just sinners waiting to happen, their soul goes to hell. It's just if God does it. And if a woman can do it and does do it, it's because God wanted it to happen. It's not incidental. It's not a glitch. It must have been so. If an old woman dies because she dies in her sleep, or she's struck by a bus, or a 15-year-old commits suicide, or a baby dies just mysteriously one night in their crib, all of that is because God wanted it. Regardless of how it happened, regardless of the agency, regardless of malice, right? So if it's all just a wash, then what is the point? Again, if God can create a world in which people can just be created and killed that quickly, why is he judging anyone for anything at this point? Does that make sense if you take a broader view of how Darth is laying out this mechanism? Oh, we don't have to get emotional about kids dying early. What about the 98-year-old woman? He knows better than that, right? One person has lived a full life and had lots of experiences, and another is a child that doesn't even get to experience life, nothing. And in its brief experience on Earth, it gets to experience an enormous amount of pain and suffering and then expire. As far as Darth is concerned, that is no different than the 98-year-old. Okay. If God is looking at it that way, why did God create a human being to suffer and die for 2 years? It's only going to live to be about 18 months old. Maybe it's only going to be allowed to live for 18 minutes in excruciating agony. Then what happens to its soul? When Darth has been presented with questions like that, he's basically told people that he doesn't give a shit. If the soul gets sent to hell or if it gets sent to heaven, that's up to God's good urge and whatever. Darth thinks he's got his ticket punched for heaven. Everyone else can pound sand. That's all this means. So when somebody comes at him with an objection about, hey, your God's a dickhead, you're a dickhead, the story is stupid, this is why people are rejecting this, nobody believes it's real, because it's a shit story, filled with a shit thing. Right? This is worse than anything Clive Barker ever created. This is worse than any monster that creeps out of a hole in a Stephen King novel. Right? He doesn't give a shit. Nope, it's got to be true. And and you know what? It's on my side, and it's making sure that I get the big ticket. I win the lotto. You don't. You didn't pick the winning side. I did. I'm right. You're wrong. Fuck you. That's all Darth's position is.
Okay, I'll frame it differently. So we have this like clear. Okay, why does God not let these people who have not had much time on the earth, who have not had the capability or culpability to sin to an extent to be warranted to go to hell, why does God not let, let's say, a 2-year-old show that they can go to God and try to aim for divinity and salvation.
Well, how do you know?
How do you when he starts doing that, when you get the how do you know, but you get like a rev up, like a motor trying to kick over, some little engine trying to start, it's not going to be good.
God, in his omniscience, doesn't already know what they will freely choose to do.
What difference does that make
in the next year, or the next 10 years, and the next 20 years?
Is it just to pre-punish people? Is that just? So I guess as far as Darth Dawkins is concerned, of course, if God creates a human being that in 2 years or 4 years or 8, let's say he creates a kid that is going to turn out to be the world's worst psychopath and commit one of the worst atrocities by the tender age of 15, but God snuffed him out just in time. He snuffed him out at the age of 2. Whew, thanks God. What difference does it make if he allows it or doesn't? What difference does it make? The only difference that it makes is that, the victims of that kid, if God didn't kill that kid at 2, he would have gone on at the tender age of 15 to commit the greatest atrocity. And all the people that died, the destination of their eternal souls is up to them individually. It's on you. If you end up in hell, tough shit. You should have called it right. I don't know on what grounds is Darth talking about. If God is creating a being that he knows will be bad and is killing it off early to prevent it from being bad. That's insane.
And God just preemptively gives them cessation of life. Okay. The fact of the matter is, you are just introducing the idea of children dying or suffering. It's an emotional argument. Because
sorry about that, Trude. That wasn't for you. If that's what you.
Because if it's not an emotional argument, you would have talked about 15-year-olds or 98-year-olds. Okay.
Well, Dawkins, if God already knows whether somebody will commit sin,
are we clear that when you're invoking little children dying and suffering, what lies behind that is an emotional argument?
What lies behind almost everything in theology are emotional arguments. It's a 1-2 punch, right? The setup is to make you worried about what happens to you after death. Everybody fears the veil, right? We don't know what happens after we pass off into the big sleep, right? The fear is, right, and this to me is no different than what happens if you're sick or something like that. You go to sleep and the big fear is you wake up, in pain, right? That's something everybody's a little nervous about, right? Or going under the knife, for a surgery. And wondering when I come out of this, how much pain am I going to be in when I come to, right? Imagine the pain that you're in when you pass off, you slip off this, off this mortal coil and wake up and you're in hell, right? And it's not the screenshot that I picked is Rowan Atkinson as Toby the devil. That's not anywhere near as whimsical as that. You just wake up to an eternity of incessant pain and suffering, right? That would terrify somebody, right? You want to avoid that, don't you? That's an emotional argument. It's fraught with emotion. It's designed to be. That's the whole point.
Dawkins, I just want to make it clear. I'm not.
Don't answer me. I'll server meet you. Because every time I ask you a question,
I understand.
Okay, have a nice day.
Dawkins,
okay, yeah, have a nice day. See, this is what they do. Okay,
what
just want to beat it.
Sit and listen to you for 20 minutes? That's what the kid did. He sat there and listened to you for 19 minutes, and you talked almost straight, with the exception of a few interjections and a couple of questions.
Dead horse that's been answered over and over and over again, right? And they just want to invoke emotional imagery, right?
Like eternal conscious torment isn't emotional imagery. I mean, I don't want to give them any credit, but Christians sort of have the market cornered on that emotional argument.
Now, the issue is God permitting?
Hang on a second. Point. How does one unhide a comment at Jefferson? I don't know. If you hit it, I think you just right click on it and then you can, or maybe you can't. It depends on what you do to the individual, I think, or what you did to the comment. Oh, I think you're talking about boot the door. Yeah, I think you hit his comment, but yeah, maybe. I don't know if I can even do that. I think once it's hidden, it's hidden. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't let me unhide it either. So I think it's permanent.
Suffering at all, whether you're a newborn, what difference does it make whether you're a newborn or you're 15 or you're 40 or you're 98? What difference does it make? They're still human beings within a sequence of development, right? So you'll notice that the people always go back. Oh, little children, child dying in Africa. Yeah, I personally find that unpleasant too. I find little
I don't believe him.
children in America dying unpleasant.
I mean, to the extent that he's human, and I think all humans basically have that reaction. My guess, though, is not to diagnose him any more than everyone's already diagnosed him. I think that when a kid dies, Darth's initial reaction is to figure out how to justify the kid deserving it. So
I find that 15-year-olds, okay, every single day they're going to be people of varying ages, especially young people who die. It's very unpleasant, but it's all a part of God's sovereign plan. See, this is all they've got, you know. Oh wow. Through the course of human history, there's death and suffering. Therefore, your God can't be good. No.
It's not it's not as simplistic as that. Given the properties of that God, why is there the amount of suffering that you see in the world? Right. And if the answer to that is, well, sin and people just did it to themselves, yeah, it's a little bit more than that, right? And and in a way, see, this is one of those things that where like a deist wouldn't really have an issue with this, right? Like a deist kind of believing that, yeah, there was something that kind of kickstarted all of reality, and then it just kind of shuffles off and goes on to create more realities or whatever. Who knows? Whatever, right? But it created things. There was an unmoved mover, right, that moved on. Sorry. And then everything that's here is just basically left up to the natural processes that were kickstarted, right? Evolution and all the things that we've discovered about the naturalistic explanations that we have for us, and then that kind of explains why there's suffering and there's pain and things can go bad, right? And in populations of natural animals like humans are, there, right? It's grounded in a naturalistic explanation of how things work. It gets more complicated when you add God. I really think that Darth Dawkins, and along with a lot of other Christians, thinks that it gets simplified. And there's actually an interesting reason behind this, and I'll probably bring that up as soon as this wraps up.
You're just saying he can't be good because you wouldn't institute creation and redemptive history the way he does.
And that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what Thurli would have done given that he had those powers. Here's the question for Darth. If Thurli had the properties that you believe God has, if Thurli behaved in these ways or created a reality that had some of these features, would those features be in contradiction to Thurli's properties? Right? Like, now, if you just want to bring the, like, oh, you just don't think that it's great because you just want to judge God and that's not your preference. No, actually, here's the thing. Does Darth think that God has a preference and this is how he wants things to work out? Right? It has to be. If you believe that the central motivation for this God, who shouldn't have a motivation, it's a perfect being. It shouldn't be motivated by anything, right? But according to most Christian theologians and most believers that hit the pews every Sunday and get these messages from pastors, the thing is, God does this to what? It's doing it to glorify itself. It is maximizing its glory. A perfect being cannot maximize its glory when its glory is already maximized. Otherwise, it wouldn't be perfect. But that basic contradiction aside, this is something that gets repeated. Church after church, Bible study after Bible study, apologist after apologist. God is doing this to maximize his glory. How does that maximize his glory? The amount of suffering present in the world maximizes God's glory. How and why? If you can explain that connection, then you'd be well on your way to being able to solve this, right? And Darth would be in great company too, because he would actually have come up with a theodicy that is a good defense against the problems of evil and problems of suffering. As it stands now, the problem of evil is the number one most contentious. It is the number one problem within kind of Christian theological thought. By their own admission, it has its own category of counter apologetics. They're called theodicies. They have their own special category because the problem of evil and problem of suffering plague Christian thought so much, and not just Christian thought, but a lot of theological thinking.
Okay. All you're just simply saying is it's not a part of your hierarchy of values. So what? You don't.
If let's say that he was saying that, right? If he was saying that, actually, I believe so. It's not a part of his values, right? Okay, so he's making the determination based on the story that you're giving him, right? And he believes that there is sort of a plurality of accepted values that people have come to agree upon. We have shared notions of what we believe justice to be, right? But this is the thing that I always find interesting. Like, is capital punishment just? Darth Dawkins thinks that's probably no. Well, people that decide that or not, that's left up to our subjective understanding. But that's not it. Justice is about meting out a punishment for a wrongdoing. I'm not making a judgment about what is and what isn't a wrongdoing. I'm saying what justice is. Justice is about meting out punishment towards a person who has committed some infraction. Mercy is forgiving someone of a punishment they probably deserve, right? If you have a God that is perfectly just and perfectly merciful, it must mete out punishment to people who commit infractions, however you want to define those, and it must also forgive for any transgression. That's the antithesis. When Darth comes along and says, well, Jesus explains it, Jesus provides the solution to this antithesis, I would be willing to agree with him as long as he was willing to acknowledge that he would and emphasize God must forgive as much as he's prepared to emphasize God must punish. At no point in talking with Thurli did he ever bring up that basic property. God must forgive. That's why there's a problem of suffering. Not because God's willing to punish people, not because he's allowed to, not because he can put up with stuff, not because we can put up with stuff, not because of our endurance or his forethought. He must forgive. So why is there suffering? Because the suffering that Darth is talking about is a motivation to go to him. It's a pre-punishment and a warning for the punishment that might be waiting for you after your soul gets ripped out your body. But he must forgive. As much as he must punish, he must forgive. And Darth fucked that up. So he hasn't done anything about that. That is the central problem, at least for me, with the problem of suffering, is that God has to be as merciful as he is just. And Darth doesn't hold to that. He just thinks God must punish and he can forgive. Wrong. That's wrong. He has to do both per those properties. And if he doesn't, you have contradictions.
You don't have omniscience. So you have a limited perspective as to what, how, and why God permits things, both on a broad scale and on a fine-tuned scale. So all we just have is arrogant human beings who are haughty, who are arrogant, who are cocky, who think they're wiser than God.
Agreed. That's exactly what we heard from Darth. A slob, arrogant guy, haughty, thinking that he's wiser than God. He's positing a God that somehow or another is not a basic contradiction. It cannot both have to be mete out justice and forgive at the same time. And if Darth thinks that somehow Jesus coming along meets this, he's also wrong about that too. Darth has explained that away by saying, well, Jesus provides the scapegoat as the punishment because God must punish. So Jesus is going to step in and take that bullet, and that's an example of God meting out his punishment, which he must do, and forgiving everyone, which he also must do. But then Christians screw it up and are like, if you don't acknowledge what God did for you, you are going to hell. That does not compute. Even if you're willing to accept the fact that he's not a contradiction, and you're willing to accept this explanation of Jesus as somehow explaining away that antithesis, inserting into that later on that your belief state is necessary for you to obtain that forgiveness, means that God forgives you so he can punish you. Jesus died, so he's justified in sending you to hell. That's the monster Darth's constructed. That's what's entailed. And with that, I'll wrap things up. Thanks everybody for showing up. Thanks for stopping by. Hope this is interesting for you, but I'm going to wrap it up here. This went on longer than I thought it probably should have. I thought I was going to get this done in about an hour and a half, but a little bit longer. Take care, everybody. I need to get going. I've got a few things to do. Otherwise, I'd bring people in, but I'm not going to do that today. I might be streaming again tomorrow. It's going to depend on what kind of time I've got, but well, you'll see me. I'll try to schedule it in advance so people know. It'll probably be early tomorrow afternoon. Take care, everybody. Be good. Have fun. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great weekend.